Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 112 Introduction to Criminology. My name is Tony Farrar, and I am, of course, your instructor for this semester. Tonight's lecture is going to cover Chapter 7. If you recall back in Chapter 6, we looked at social structure theory, which encompassed things like social disorganization and strain theory and cultural deviance. Tonight's lecture, we're going to look at social process, which is going to consist of a couple of different parts, but we'll look at social learning theories, social control theory, and social reaction or labeling theory. So with that being said, let's go ahead and just jump right into our lecture. We have a lot to cover. So what are we going to cover? Well, first we're going to take a look at the concepts of social process and define socialization. We will also discuss the effect of family relationships on crime, discuss how the educational setting impacts crime, does it or does it not? We will summarize the link between peers and delinquency, and then we'll finish up with contrasting these three different things: the social learning, social control, and social reaction theories themselves. So a quick case study to get us going. On January 18th, 2015, Stanford University student athlete Brock Turner was arrested for sexually assaulting an unconscious woman behind a dumpster. Now, on March 30th, 2016, Turner was found guilty of 3 felonies: assault with intent to commit rape or to rape an intoxicated woman, sexually penetrating an intoxicated person with a foreign object, and sexually penetrating an unconscious person with a foreign object. Now, what happened after the guilt was established was what really made national headlines. The judge in this case, Aaron Piersky, heard from all of the individuals at the sentencing hearing. The victim read a very emotional statement, and as part of what the prosecutor had to say, is that he asked for a 6-year sentence, telling the court that Brock Turner purposely took this person to an isolated area away from all the party goers and assaulted her on the ground behind a dumpster. He went on to say that he deliberately took advantage of the fact that she was so intoxicated that she could not even form a sentence, yet alone keep her eyes open. And this type of behavior is someone that is not your average criminal, but more of a predator, if you will. And at the end of the day, even though the prosecutor asked for, the sentence that he asked for, the 6-year sentence, the judge ended up sentencing Turner to 6 months in jail. He basically believed Turner's story, that initially the victim consented. But this was something that the jury actually rejected, which makes it even more interesting. So the judge kind of went over and above the jury. And the judge took into account the fact that Turner was remorseful and had no criminal record, was young, not armed at the time of the crime, and that he would comply with all of the terms of probation. And the judge also said that the role of alcohol, while not an excuse, did play a role in assessing the moral culpability. And it turns out at the end of this whole thing that Turner's sentence was reduced to 3 months due to an automatically applied credit that you get for good behavior. And you can see some of the outcry and recall efforts that were kind of laid against the judge, if you will, for his particular decision in this case. Now, this case raises some issues. First, the Turner case shows that a crime is a highly subjective concept, that an act is considered a crime maybe only when the judge or the jury labels it like that. And in this case, if the jury believed Turner that the victim consented, then there would be no crime that occurred and he would be not guilty. And the outcome here may have also hinged on Turner's personal characteristics. He wasn't a gang member or an ex-offender, but at the end of the day, he was considered a promising athlete. And when you consider cases that are similar, you look at Brock Turner and the Corey Beatty case, the same type of crime but a big difference as far as sentencing goes. Beatty, who was a former Vanderbilt football player, and Brock Turner, who was a swimmer at Stanford University. So Beatty, in a similar crime, was sentenced to 15 to 25 years in jail for raping an unconscious woman. Now, there were other people involved, but it was still similar, where Turner ends up with 3 months in jail. So, we have to kind of ask some questions before we move on. Would he have been treated differently if he were an African American or a high school dropout? Are labels and stigma subjectively applied? Now, as part of his sentence, Turner, who later moved to his family's home in Ohio, he was required to register as a sex offender. His picture, conviction information, and address were publicly made available on the registry, etc. He can't go within 1,000 feet of any school or any playground. And if you want to read more about the report or whatever, you can look here. I even have a link to CNN's article about this particular thing, and the fact that Turner is appealing because he now has to register as a sex offender. So the Turner case really illustrates that both the concept of crime and criminality are shaped or can be shaped by social forces and institutions. People are not born criminals, but rather engage in antisocial behaviors as a result of their involvement with significant social groups, such as family, peers, and neighbors, and critical social institutions, such as schools, law enforcement agencies, etc. And that people are socialized over the life course. Relationships can be either positive and supportive, or dysfunctional and destructive, depending upon how people look at that. So we're going to get into this social process theory a little bit more, but I want to make sure that we get in our weekly fact or fiction. So with that being said, remember, we're talking about the social process. So fact or fiction: gang members reduce their criminal activity if they receive effective parental monitoring. Fact or fiction: research shows that proper parenting can reduce delinquent activity even among committed gang members. Now remember, we might answer these, we might not, as we go through the lecture, but let's kind of turn our eyes to now the social process theory. And we kind of already said it, but the Turner case does illustrate the concept of crime and criminality and how it can be shaped by these social forces. And we know that people are socialized over the life course, and we know that relationships, of course, can be positive or negative. And depending on the interaction, some people may learn to become criminal and then consider themselves to be like that. And others may feel that social institutions have let them down and not really given them the guidance or the control that they need. Others may just run afoul of social institutions, as Brock Turner did, and be labeled a deviant or outcast. And this view of crime that we're going to get into now is referred to as the social process theory. So a little bit more. The social process approach has several independent branches: social learning theory, social control theory, and social reaction, or what they call labeling theory. Socialization, or being socialized, defined, so we know what that is the process of acquiring social norms, values, behavior, and skills through interactions with significant others, like teachers or parents, or even our peers. So the three things that we're going to talk about, these three branches that fall under social process, is going to be social learning theory, social control theory, and then social reaction theory, that is also called labeling theory. So again, social learning theories assume that people are born good and learn to be bad. Social control theory assumes that people are born bad and must be controlled in order to be good. And social reaction theory assumes that whether good or bad, people are shaped, directed, and influenced by the evaluations of others. And again, all three forms of social process theories, they do have some basic concepts. But let's kind of look at each one individually quickly, and then we'll get into it a little deeper. So the social learning theory assumes people are born good and learn to be bad. They learn these techniques and attitudes from close relationships with, let's say, criminal peers. And that crime is a learned behavior. Now, I put this picture in here only to show you that sometimes hanging out with a certain group of individuals, and if this is the group here we're going to talk about, the peers, and they're involved in, let's say, gangs, excuse me, or what have you, then yes, you might learn some bad habits, if you will, from some of these individuals. Now, the social control theory says that, hey, everybody has the potential to become a criminal, but most people are controlled by their bonds to society. It assumes people are born bad, but have to be controlled to be good. And then crime occurs when the forces that bind these people to society are kind of weakened or broken. And then the third one of the branch, and again, we'll get into them deeper, is the social reaction or labeling theory. And it basically says that people become criminals when significant members of society label them as such. And they accept those labels as a personal identity. So, again, all three forms of this social process theory or theories, they do share basic concepts. One, socialization is a key to understanding criminal behavior choices. Two, socialization occurs through contact with others. Three, anyone can turn to antisocial behavior if their socialization is damaged or destructive. Crime is not solely a lower class phenomenon. And then the last one, 4, because criminal behavior is a function of socialization, it can be reversed, and criminals can turn around through proper resocialization, if you will. So social process theorists then have long studied the critical elements of socialization to determine how they contribute to a criminal career. And their view relies on the fact that interaction with key social institutions help control human behavior. And prominent among these elements are individuals' family, peer group, schools, and church. So we'll start with the subcategory of social process theorists, and we'll look at family relations. Family relationships are considered a major determinant of behavior. Parenting factors, such as the ability to communicate and provide proper discipline, may play a critical role in determining whether people misbehave as children and even later as adults. So again, it's considered to be a major determinant. And this parental efficacy is what they call it, is the ability of parents to be supportive of their children and effectively control them in typically non-coercive ways. But there are some other factors that kind of lend to this social process. And one can be, let's say, the effects of divorce. The relationship between family structure and crime is critical when the high rates of divorce and single parents are considered. Family deviance. A number of studies have found that parental deviance has a powerful influence on children's behavior. When parents drink, take drugs, and commit crimes, the effects of this can be both devastating and even long-term. Family stress can be another one. Distressed families can put children at risk as well. Violence and abuse. Children who grow up in homes where parents use over strict discipline become prone to antisocial behavior. A recent meta-analysis of 33 studies, that means a look at all of these studies, kind of showed that the association between violence and physical and sexual abuse showed clear-cut evidence that the two factors are closely linked. So, the effects of parental discipline and physical and emotional abuse can have an impact on this entire social process. Even the educational experience, the educational process and adolescent achievement in school have been linked directly to criminality, and children who do poorly in school, fail at their coursework, do not have a strong bond to that educational experience. They lack educational motivation and sometimes feel alienated. And those individuals are more than likely to commit criminal acts. Children who fail in school commit more serious and violent offenses and persist in their offending into adulthood. And schools contribute to criminality when they start to label these problem children or youth and set them apart from conventional society. And one way in which schools perpetuate this stigma is what they call the track system, which identifies some students as college bound and others as not, or maybe even special needs. And again, part of this educational experience can include other things. All too often, educational problems lead to students leaving school early and becoming dropouts. And even though the national dropout rates are in decline, more than 10% of Americans age 6 to 24 have left school prematurely without a diploma. Of these, more than 1 million withdrew before completing the 10th grade. And most kids who drop out show danger signs as early as the 4th grade, and serious problems begin to manifest in their first year of high school. So, this is a big thing, the educational experience. And when you talk about race and educational problems, African American children are much more likely to, rather than their European American peers, to suffer problems at school. And as a result, some minority students are more likely to disengage from school at a younger age or drop out. And then you can bring up the whole issue, that happen in schools about getting, let's say, bullied. Students are also subject to violence and intimidation on school grounds, and national data indicates that in a single year, about 20% or 22%, of all public schools report bullying occurred among students on a daily or even a weekly basis. And you don't have to watch it, but I put in a link to a video of what happened to a young girl by the name of Rosalie Avila. And if you want to take the time to look at her story, you can. Peer relations. Criminologists have long recognized that peer group relations have a powerful effect on human conduct and can dramatically influence decision-making and behavior choices. The more antisocial the peer group, the more likely its members will engage in delinquency, and even virtual exposure to antisocial peers they meet online can trigger antisocial behavior. So with the advent of the internet and everything else, we have to kind of keep that stuff in mind. What about things like religion and belief? Well, logic would dictate that people who hold high moral values and beliefs, who have learned to distinguish right from wrong, and who regularly attend religious services should also shy away from crime and other antisocial behavior. Religion binds people together and forces them to confront the consequences of their behavior. Having a high moral belief may enhance the deterrent effect of punishment by convincing even motivated offenders not to risk apprehension and punishment. Committing crimes would violate the principles of some of these organized religions. So again, some recent research has shown that attending or participating in religious services, or having not just the belief but participation and attendance, does have an impact on an individual as far as crime goes. So when you look at these three theories, and again, we're going to start to jump into them now, you can see how they all fit within the social process approach. On page 218 in your textbook, you can see the same diagram that you're looking at, and it talks again, it gives you a definition: social learning theory. Criminal behavior is learned through human interaction. On the right at the top, social control theory. Human behavior is controlled through close associations with people and places or institutions. And then the bottom, social reaction, or what's called labeling theory, where people are given negative labels by authority figures, and they accept those labels as kind of like what they are. That's their prophecy, if you will. And all of those together have that function of the social process approach. So now let's dive a little deeper into each one of those. So we're going to start with social learning theories. So we know social learning theorists believe that crime is a product of learning the norms, values, and behaviors associated with criminal activity. And social learning can involve the actual techniques of crime, like how to steal a car or sell drugs, as well as the psychological aspects of criminality, how to deal with guilt or shame, or something similar. So we kind of covered that. One of the most prominent social learning theories is Edwin Sutherland's differential association theory. Often considered the preeminent U.S. criminologist, Sutherland first put forth his theory in 1939 in an article called The Principles of Criminology. And the final version of the theory appeared in 1947. When Sutherland died in 1950, his longtime associate continued his work until his death in 1987. And really what it comes down to is Sutherland believed crime was a function of a learning process that could affect any individual in any culture. Acquiring a behavior is a socialization process, so it's a process, not a legal or a political thing. And skills and motives conducive to crime are learned as a result of contact with pro-crime values or attitudes or and definitions and other patterns of criminal behavior. And so again, acquiring a behavior, it is a socialization process. It's not some type of legal thing, okay? And in this principles of differential association theory, Sutherland and his predecessor, Cressy, explain some of the basic principles. And I'm going to cover them just very quickly. The first one is that criminal behavior is learned. The second one, criminal behavior is learned as a byproduct of interacting with others. The third one, learning criminal behavior occurs within intimate personal groups. The fourth one, learning criminal behavior involves assimilating the techniques of committing crime, including motives and drives and rationalization and attitudes. The fifth one, the specific direction of motives and drives is learned from perceptions of various aspects of the legal code as favorable and unfavorable. 6, a person becomes a criminal when he or she perceives more favorable than unfavorable consequences to violating the law. And then number 7, differential associations may vary in frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. And the last 2, the process of learning criminal behavior by association with criminal and anti-criminal patterns involves all of the mechanisms that are involved in any other learning process. And then finally, the last one, although criminal behavior expresses general needs and values, it is not excused by those general needs and values, because non-criminal behavior expresses the same needs and values. So these are all, again, some basic principles of differential association theory. And one kind of really interesting case, it's on page 221 in your textbook, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it's the affluenza case. And basically what it is back in 2013, a 16-year-old Texas boy killed 4 people while driving drunk. And what was unusual about this case is that the individual was sentenced to a decade of probation, even though prosecutors had sought a maximum sentence, again, of 20 years. You think about the first case study that we did with Brock Turner. And one reason for the light sentence was that during the trial, a psychologist testified that this young kid suffered from affluenza. In other words, on the night of the crash, he didn't understand the consequences of his actions because his parents had taught him that wealth buys privilege, and he could do anything he wanted, without any consequences. And again, it's kind of an interesting case, and I don't want to take up too much of our lecture time, but looking at it, you kind of look at that. We're talking about status and things like that in the previous chapter. Well, this kind of brings that particular part home, if you will. Okay, so another theory that falls underneath here is what is referred to as the differential reinforcement theory. And first proposed by Ronald Akers in collaboration with Robert Burgess in 1966, differential reinforcement theory is a version of the social learning view that employs both differential association concepts and elements of the psychological learning theory. Now, according to Akers, the same process is involved in learning both deviant and conventional behavior. People learn to be neither all deviant nor all conforming, but rather strike a balance between the two opposing poles of behavior. And this balance is usually stable, but it can undergo revision over time. So, another kind of interesting sub-theory. And a number of learning processes shape behavior. Direct conditioning is also called differential reinforcement. Occurs when behavior is reinforced by being either rewarded or punished while interacting with others. And then negative reinforcement occurs when the rate of a behavior increases because an adverse event or stimulus is removed or prevented from happening. So Akers' theory here suggests that the principal influence on behavior comes from those groups that control a person's reinforcement or punishment, if you will. Next, we'll talk about something called neutralization theory. So neutralization theory is identified with the writings of Gresham Sykes and his associate David Matza. And these criminologists also view the process of becoming a criminal as a learning experience. And they both theorize that law violators must learn and master techniques that enable them to neutralize conventional values and attitudes, which then enables them to drift back and forth between illegitimate and conventional behavior. So they have to learn how to do this, how to think like a criminal today and maybe not tomorrow, if you will. So kind of different. So neutralization theory points out that even the most committed criminals and delinquents are not involved in criminality all the time. They also attend school, family functions, and maybe even religious services. Thus, their behavior falls along a continuum between total freedom and restraint. And this process of drift is what they call it, or movement from one extreme to another, produces behavior that is sometimes unconventional or deviant, and at other times constrained, and sober. So learning neutralization techniques equips a person to temporarily drift away from conventional behavior, the normal, non-crime committing, and then become involved in antisocial behavior, including crime and drug abuse. So what are some of these techniques, if you will? So Sykes and Matza suggest that people develop a distinct set of justifications for their law-violating behavior. And several observations form the basis for this model. So let's kind of look at some of those really quick. The first one is that criminals sometimes voice guilt over their acts. If they truly embraced criminal or antisocial values, criminals would probably not exhibit any type of remorse for their acts, apart from maybe regret from getting caught. Number two, offenders frequently respect and admire honest, law-abiding persons. So those admired may include entertainers or sports figures or other members of society, maybe even parents, teachers, and neighbors. Number three, criminals define whom they can victimize. Members of similar ethnic groups, churches, or neighborhoods are often off limits. This practice implies that criminals are aware of the wrongfulness of their acts. So again, it kind of defines who they criminalize. And then finally, criminals are not immune to the demands of conformity. So most criminals participate in the same social functions as law-abiding people, like going to school, to church, family activities, and few engage in illegal activity all the time. So again, this is where both Sykes and Matza suggest that people develop a distinct set of justifications for their law-violating behavior. So with that, let's look at a couple of other things. So Sykes and Matza also conclude that criminals must first neutralize accepted social values before they're free to commit crimes. So they do so by learning a set of techniques that allow them to counteract that moral dilemma posed by illegal behavior. So through their research, Sykes and Matza have identified the following techniques that we're going to go over about neutralization and how these people kind of mitigate it, if you will. The first one is denial of responsibility. Young offenders sometimes claim that their unlawful acts, they're not their fault. The next one, denial of injury. By denying the injury their acts cause, criminals neutralize illegal behavior. So an example could be stealing is viewed as borrowing and vandalism as something that just got out of hand. The next one is denial of the victim. Criminals sometimes neutralize wrongdoing by maintaining that the victim had it coming. The next one, condemnation of the condemners. An offender views the world as a corrupt place with a dog-eat-dog kind of code. And because police and judges are on the take, they have favorites, and parents take their frustrations out on kids, offenders claim that it's unfair, etc. And then the last one is appeal to higher loyalties. And this might be where novice criminals often argue that they are caught in the dilemma of being loyal to their peer group while attempting to abide by the rules of society. So these are some of the things, again, that fall under the neutralization theory. And in your textbook on page 224, there's a diagram, if you will, that looks at the techniques of neutralization. So you can look at that at your leisure. So now let's kind of move on and talk a little bit about social control theory again. So social control theorists again maintain that all people have the potential to violate the law, and that modern society presents many opportunities for illegal activity. Criminal activities such as drug abuse and car theft are often exciting pastimes that hold the promise of immediate reward and gratification. Now, considering the attractions of crime, Social control theorists question why people obey the rules of society. They argue that people obey the law because behavior and passions are controlled by internal and external forces. And some individuals have self-control, a strong moral sense that renders them incapable of hurting others and violating social norms. And other people have been socialized to have a commitment to conformity. They have developed a real, present, and logical reason to obey the rules of society, and they instinctively avoid behavior that will jeopardize their reputation and achievements. The stronger people's commitment to the conventional institutions, individuals, and processes, the less likely they are to commit crime. It is that, and if that commitment is absent, then there is little to lose and people are free to violate the law. So under this thing again, we're talking about self-control, commitment to conformity, and social bonds. Now, Hershey, and this isn't the chocolate, it's just how you pronounce his name, the version of social control theory articulated by Travis Hershey in his influential 1969 book, Causes of Delinquency, is today the dominant version of control theory. And Hershey links the onset of criminality to the weakening of the ties that bind people to society. And he assumes that all individuals are potential law violators, but most are kept under control because they fear that the illegal behavior will damage their relationships with friends, family, neighbors, teachers, or even employers. And without these social bonds or these ties, a person is free to commit criminal acts. And this is across all ethnic, religious, racial, and social groups. People whose bond to society is weak may fall prey to criminal behavior patterns. And here's a diagram that's on page 227 in your textbook that talks about the conforming behavior and the four things that we just kind of went over: the attachment, the commitment, the belief, and the involvement, and how each one kind of fits in there that helps define part of his theory process. So in testing this, if we're going to test social control theory, let's look at a little bit of supporting research. So one of Hershey's most significant contributions to criminality was his attempt to test the principal hypothesis of social control theory. And he administered a detailed self-report survey to a sample of more than 4,000 junior and senior high school students in Contra Costa County, California. In a detailed analysis of the data, Hershey found considerable evidence to support the control theory model society. And even when the statistical significance of Hershey's findings was less than kind of expected, the direction of his research data was very, very consistent. And in there were some little sub things that we're going to kind of look at now when what he did or what was found. The first was attachment. That kids who are attached to their families, friends, and schools are less likely to get involved in a deviant group, therefore less likely to engage in crime. The second was belief, that research has shown that holding positive beliefs is inversely related to criminal activity. Kids who are involved in religious activities are in fact less likely to become involved in delinquent activity. Commitment, as predicted, kids who are committed to school and educational achievement are less likely to become involved in delinquent behavior than those who lack that commitment. And involvement. Research shows that youths, again, who are involved in conventional leisure activities, supervised social activities, and non-competitive sports are in fact less likely to engage in any type of delinquency. Now we're going to talk about the last of the three, social reaction theory or labeling theory. So the third type of social process theory is also called labeling theory. And here's some of the key points. Behaviors that are considered criminal are highly subjective because people label them as such. So things like murder, rape, and assault. So in its purest form, behaviors that are considered criminal are highly subjective because, again, people label them as such. Number two, crime is defined by those in power. The content and shape of criminal law are defined by the values of those who rule and are not an objective standard of moral conduct. Interesting enough, Howard Becker refers to people who create the rules as moral entrepreneurs. An example of a moral entrepreneur is someone who campaigns against violence in the media and wants laws passed to restrict the content of television shows. So kind of an interesting thing there. The next one, not only acts are labeled, but people are too, meaning that labels define not just an act, but also the actor. And valued labels like smart and honest and hardworking suggest overall competence. And different labels might be a little bit more stigmatized. So if you were to look at labels like, oh, I don't know, let's say troublemaker, mentally ill, stupid, those are ones that stigmatize the individual and have that self-image on there. And then the last one here, both positive and negative labels involve subjective interpretation of behavior. A troublemaker is merely someone who people label as troublesome. So these are just a couple of, key points, if you will. And think of it like this. Here's a very quick example when it comes to labeling. So we'll look at California Penal Code 261.5. And it's the definition of statutory rape. And the reason it's statutory is because it's written. All California law is written. So a statutory rape takes place when any person engages in sexual intercourse with a person under the age of 18. And gender doesn't matter here. A female can be older, the male can be older, it doesn't really matter, but someone has to be under 18. The crime of statutory rape is also commonly referred to as unlawful sex with a minor or unlawful sexual intercourse. The problem or the issue with that is that we label it. A lot of people know that there's sex going on, let's say between minors or someone that might be 18 and someone 17. But if somebody's called out on it or they're arrested for it, and if they're prosecuted, then they're going to be labeled possibly as a rapist. The section is called statutory rape by definition. So again, there can be some negative things that come out of this, or consequences, if you will. So although a label may be a function of rumor or innuendo or unfounded suspicion, its adverse impact can be quite immense. If a devalued status is conferred by a significant other, a teacher, police officer, parent, or valued peer, the negative label may permanently harm that particular person, or what we call the target. Now, the degree to which a person is perceived as a social deviant may affect his or her treatment at home, at work, at school, and in other social situations. I mean, you have to think about that. Children may find that their parents consider them a bad influence on younger brothers and sisters. School officials may limit them to classes reserved for people with behavior problems. And likewise, when adults are labeled as a criminal or, quote, ex-con or, quote, drug addict, they may find their eligibility for employment severely restricted. And if the label is bestowed as the result of a conviction for a criminal offense, the labeled person may also be subjected to official sanctions, ranging from a mild reprimand to incarceration. So the simultaneous effects of labels and sanctions reinforce feelings of isolation and detachment. And what this can actually lead into is something that we call stigmatize, which is to apply a negative label with enduring effects on a person's self-image and social interactions. So, although again, the label may be a function of rumor, innuendo, or what have you, it can really have a long-term effect. So we kind of go down to the bottom of the slide. We covered some of this already, but if the label is the result of a conviction, like the ex-con example, or the drug addict one, or in the case of maybe the unlawful sexual intercourse, where they label you a rapist when maybe it was voluntary on both ends, and one person 18, one 17, but yet because it's written in the statute, it's deemed to be unlawful. And just so you know that that is lawful in some states and unlawful, the age differences are a little bit different. But let's talk a little bit more about kind of the stigmatism part here. To apply negative labeling with enduring effects on a person's self-image and social interactions. And there is something out there called self-labeling. According to labeling theory, depending upon the visibility of the label and the manner and severity in which it is applied, negatively labeled individuals will become increasingly committed to a deviant career. Labeled persons may find themselves turning for support and companionship to others who have been similarly stigmatized. So kind of an interesting thing. What about joining deviant cliques? People labeled as deviant may join with similarly outcasted peers who facilitate their behavior, and eventually antisocial behavior becomes habitual and automatic. And the desire to join deviant cliques and groups may stem from self-rejecting attitudes, weakening communities to conventional values and behaviors, and in turn, stigmatized individuals may require or acquire motives to deviate from social norms because they now share a common bond with these other similar individuals. Retrospective reading. This is where beyond an immediate result, labels tend to redefine the whole person. Again, the label ex-con may evoke in people's imaginations a whole series of behavior descriptions, or labels: tough, mean, dangerous, aggressive, dishonest. And that may or may not apply to a particular person who has been in prison. Primary and secondary deviance. One of the better known views of labeling process is Edwin Lament's concept of primary deviance and secondary deviance. According to Lamert, primary deviance involves norm violations or crimes that have little influence on the actor and can be quickly forgotten. In contrast, secondary deviance occurs when a deviant event comes to the attention of significant others or social control agents who then apply a negative label. And then finally, crime and labeling. Because the process of becoming stigmatized is essentially interactive, labeling theorists blame the establishment of criminal careers on these social agencies originally designed for crime control, like police or courts or even correctional agencies. And these institutions, labeling theorists claim, are inflicting the very stigma that harms the people they are trying to treat or correct. And as a result, they actually help to maintain and sometimes amplify that particular criminal behavior. And you can look again in your book. There's a diagram that shows the social reaction or the labeling theory. I would, if you have a chance in your textbook, I would take a look at this. You can read the article titled Long-Term Effects on Being Labeled on page 234 in your textbook. And you can think about the question, what are the consequences of being labeled a criminal? Are there actually some consequences? And this is really an interesting article. And it shows you, so the link is at the bottom, but you can look at the pictures here on an individual that spent a lot of time removing different tattoos that he had because he didn't like what he looked like because he couldn't get anywhere. So we're in the upper left right here based on what you see. And so he took all of this time and process to change his look. It really didn't change his inner person, but it changed his look, which means that people thought of him different. So an interesting article if you want to take the time to kind of look about that. All right, so a couple of other quick definitions, and we're getting close to being done. So we're going to look at something called differential enforcement. An important principle of social reaction theory is that the law is differentially applied, benefiting those who hold economic and social power and penalizing those who do not. And from the police officer's decision on whom to arrest to the prosecutor's decision on whom to charge and for how many and what kind of charges, the court's decision on release or bail, to the grand jury's decision on indictment, to the judge's decision on the length of sentence, discretion works to the detriment of minorities, including African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. And just keep in mind the term, we're not going to go into detail, but the term racial profiling, which by definition is the use of racial and ethnic characteristics by police or others in their determining whether a person is likely to commit a crime or engage in deviant or antisocial behavior. So is labeling theory valid? So we've looked at this whole labeling theory now, and now we kind of want to ask ourselves, is it valid? And this is, labeling theory has been the subject of a lot of debate amongst criminologists. And those who criticize it point to its inability to specify the conditions that must be met before an act or individual is labeled deviant. And that is why some people are labeled and others remain secret deviants. There are also questions about whether stigma produces crime. Labeling often comes after, rather than before, chronic offending. Getting labeled by the justice system and having an enduring criminal record may have little effect on people who have been burdened with social and emotional problems since birth. And while these criticisms are telling, there has been significant research showing that, as the theory predicts, people who suffer official labels are prone to a delinquent and criminal way of life. Now, recent research by Emily Restivo and Mark Lanier found that official labeling may lead to an increased delinquent self-identity, decreased pro-social expectations, and increased association with delinquent peers, which then leads to an increased likelihood of engaging in more or subsequent delinquency. So again, is this whole thing valid? So here are some of the different theories. So again, we looked at a couple. We looked at this differential and neutralization theory. So I put in a chart for you to look at. I also put in a chart Hershey's control theory and labeling theory, so you can look at those. And that's going to kind of end our lecture. So a lot of information. We made it well within the 60-minute time limit. Please take a moment to look at the key terms that are at the end of the chapter, and also review those critical thinking questions that are also at the end of the chapter to kind of stimulate your thought process. So with that being said, that will conclude our lecture for Chapter 7 on the social process theory. Until next time.